I must say that when I see all the faces, I know now why I didn't retire. Because how can anybody retire from a passion? I don't know.
Our economy and the gender inequality will catch up. As a brand, we better be prepared for that.
Last time I saw you, you were actually talking about watches that belong to your father.
Yeah, this is all your fault.
Yeah.
You guys, I said it in the video and in my intro.
Yeah.
Thanks for bringing it up, but this is all your fault. I didn't care about watches until you guys put all these videos gaming the algorithm.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Jay Fielden, a real legend of New York media. Thank you so much for coming to the UBS House of Craft. How you doing this morning?
I'm great, man. Thank you. I don't know if I'm a legend, but I tried to be.
To me and Ben Clymer, and I know at least a few others on our team, you certainly are. So we appreciate you doing this. We're here to talk about John Lennon's Patek 2499, obviously the excellent piece that you wrote in The New Yorker a few months ago. But before that, can we talk a little bit about your career in media and how watches interplay with it and how you came to just become interested in watches and how that caused you to latch onto a story like John Lennon's 2499?
Sure. I would love nothing more than to talk about this. No one else wants to. Well, okay, so I did start out as an editor at The New Yorker, or a peon, then I became an editor, and then became an editor at Vogue, and we launched this magazine called Men's Vogue, and it was around from 2006 to 2009. Anyone ever see that magazine? You remember? So it was kind of a precursor to a number of gentlemen's magazines, I guess I'll call them, that are out now, and that at that time we had this idea that we could write about things like watches, bespoke clothes, wine, rare cars, and then overlay certain journalistic kind of interesting investigative stories as well. So, you know, it was in some ways a kind of throwback to Esquire maybe of the 50s or 60s, and then it had this new layering of really looking at what is the greatest of things that exist. Not necessarily from a snob point of view. It was about taste, not money, so to speak. Of course, plenty of the things were expensive, but nonetheless, the real exercise editorially was to find things that were surprising and sometimes affordable, but really good. So this was '05, as I said. I guess people are covering watches to a certain extent in traditional men's magazines, but not really. I mean, I think it had been forgotten, and I think that a lot of you would probably have that sense that it just wasn't a hot topic for many years. For some reason, it had evaporated, and then Ben and other people started writing about watches online. We were doing it in print, and that's where it really started. That was my first kind of. I liked watches before that. I didn't know a lot about them. I had never been to Switzerland. I had never gone to what was then called SIHH. I started doing that, and I started to have to kind of keep track of not just watches, but other interesting, I would say, connoisseurial worlds that would have been about unusual things, whether it was, again, architecture and furniture, wine, cars, all these kind of worlds, and that's where it really started.
What sets watches apart for you as an interest?
I think I just found the story of watches and what happened as both a business story, a story of fanaticism, a rebirth, a renaissance of a subject that had kind of course, you all have heard the thing. After the iPhone, why doesn't anybody need a watch? After the iWatch, why does everybody need all these kinds of things? It's never everybody's going to give up on watches. It's stupid. They're like a vestigial organ or something like that. So the fact that it not only that didn't happen, but it exploded into one of the most, I think, subjects that exist today that that has the enthusiast crowd that among men around. I mean, I think in the past you would have said enthusiast crowds were like guys who like 10 speeds or, maybe wine connoisseur or something like that. But the fact that watches just kind of became this coalescing moment and brought all kinds of people together around the globe, that made me interested as a writer as well.
you're kind of talking about it here, the growth of the market, of collecting, of appreciation for watches more generally. These are all kind of abstract ideas, though. And I think something you said to me on the Hodinkee Radio podcast that we did that stuck with me is you called the John Lennon story kind of the quintessential story of watches of the past 15, 20 years, however long it's been. Can you kind of talk about what you meant by that before we get into the specifics of the story of this watch?
Yeah, well, it relates to those things I was just saying. Like I was looking for this thing where I began to see watches not just be a thing that was of interest to, say, people like us in this room, but the subject starting to spill over into mainstream press. When somebody gets held up for their Patek on Rodeo Drive or Richard Mille, when somebody gets held up for their Patek here in New York coming out of a restaurant, people start to notice these things even if they have no interest in watches. The same thing happened in wine around 07, 08 when you had this guy named Rudy Kuranawan fake a bunch of Petrus bottles. I don't know if you guys remember that, but wine was having this huge moment. Everybody's getting into it again. Younger people, all that, it wasn't so stuffy. And then suddenly this big thing happened. That was a story that was in Men's Vogue that Jay McInerney wrote. So I'd been following things like that, looking for those stories. I had done a story in Town & Country when I edited that about this mysterious Mercedes called the Caracciolo 500K, designed by a guy named Caracciolo, who was a big Grand Prix race car driver back in the 30s, a German, actually, not an Italian. Mercedes loved him. They had him design a one-off car. It had an amazing kind of history. I won't go into it, but then it just disappeared. It somehow got to America, and then no one knew what happened to it. I got wind of it being in a junkyard near LAX, which turned out to be true. We wrote the story. That was 7, 8, 10 years ago. In about 3 weeks, they're going to auction everything that was in that junkyard at Sotheby's at the end of the month, and I think that car will be in it. So those kinds of grail hunts were fascinating to me. I'd seen it in wine. I'd somewhat seen it in cars in terms of like not just writing for the cognoscenti, but starting to find stories that will not only be interesting to the cognoscenti, but now interesting to a big group of people who just want to know, what is this thing? Why are Patek Philippe that cost $30,000 at a store that you can't get worth $180,000 on the street during COVID, right? That was a story that your grandmother might be interested in reading. So I was looking for the story that might start to, maybe the beginning, first an article and then maybe a book that would, explains somewhat this moment. And that, to me, the Lennon had a lot of those elements to it.
And the story of John Lennon and his 2499, it really starts with a photo that you learned was taken by famous rock photographer Bob Gruen, followed Lennon and Yoko Ono around for years. So maybe we'll start the story there. And that's how it really starts for you. And you kind of begin to unearth and trace the entire lineage and provenance of the watch.
I approached it like a cold case, and I think that's what it is. And you guys know that there's a number of cold cases in the watch world. Some of them may be just we know that they exist, but we can't get to the Castro family, so we don't know what those Rolexes really are. But there are other ones that are true cold cases, right? The Picasso Jaeger, the Lennon watch, the moon watches of various one or another. So I was interested in this idea, just again, the lore, maybe boyhood stuff about treasure, finding things. I was interested in the idea of like, what makes something great? Why do we care? What is the standard of a beautiful object? Establishing these ideas in words so that they're not just, they don't vanish in a generation. And I felt like that was that story. So when I approached it like a cold case, I had never really been an investigative reporter at all. I had worked on a lot of pieces like that or commissioned them, but I'd never done one myself. And yet I was always very interested in, the kind of all the president's men approach to a story. And I thought, here's one that really, it has some of those elements, but it's set in the luxury world. So I just started, with common sense. People keep talking about this story. It pops up all over the place whenever there's a grouping of little bullet-pointed stories about the lost watches that no one knows where they are, whether it was in Le Figaro or GQ or Hodinkee or whatever. And that was always the picture that they showed, and yet the picture never was credited, which, having been the editor of a number of magazines, I know the danger of not crediting pictures, and I thought that's something there. Why is this picture not credited? If the story is where is this watch and why did John Lennon have it on? I would think you'd just find out who took it, and maybe that person would be able to say, oh yeah, I remember that. So I just basically tracked down who took the picture. And the way I did that was isolate, the fact that everybody said it was his birthday. I realized that on his birthday in 1980, he was in the Hit Factory recording his last album. Therefore, there would have been people at the Hit Factory, I hope, who were still alive, who would maybe remember who took that picture, or they might have stories themselves. So I called the producer of the album, who's still alive, a very interesting guy. He was, kind of a rock legend. He produced all of Aerosmith's albums and Cheap Trick and Blondie and a lot of Patti Smith, etc. He never wanted to get on the phone with me, but he would immediately email me back within 2 minutes if I asked him any question. So I sent him the picture and I said, I'm just trying to find out who took this picture. 2 seconds later, I got this thing back. Bob Gruen took that picture. So I called Bob Gruen, and I, just went from there.
One of the things that I think makes this bigger than a watch story, obviously, is John Lennon, the personality. Imagine no possessions, right, is one of the most famous lyrics or lines he ever wrote. And yet here you have Yoko Ono walking into Tiffany in 1980 for his birthday to buy a Patek Philippe 2499 perpetual calendar chronograph, one of 349 made or whatever it is. And I imagine one of the things for you that had to be fun as a journalist was puzzling out what would have even attracted Yoko and thereby Lennon to such a luxurious item like that.
Yes. I mean, I always thought that the story isn't just the story of where the watch is. It's the story of course, it is that, and the story of how the watch got where it is, and, et cetera. But it was, to me, always the curiosity of why does he have that? Well, I think that's why everybody was shocked when they see the picture. If in other words, if you looked at the whereabouts, the mysterious whereabouts of various watches, there are some that are more startling than others. I mean, the Picasso thing's kind of fascinating too, because I just don't think you associate him with that kind of thing. But Lennon, for sure. Now, the guy did have possessions, clearly, right? He had a lot of apartments in the Dakota. He had estates around in various places. Whether he wanted them or Yoko wanted them, I don't know, but he had them. He had a lot of bran muffins. He had a lot of carob-coated peanuts. He had stuff like that. He liked jukeboxes. He liked guitars. He liked vitamins. He had these kinds of things. But in terms of what we would associate with as a luxury mark of some kind, I don't think that was his deal. And he had a Rolls Royce at one point, I think probably more for marketing purposes than anything else. It was later sold. I know when one of the assistants of his, right before he was killed, was hired by him, he was driving around in an old station wagon that would break down all the time. He had to convince Yoko Ono to buy a car, and she wanted a Mercedes, so they bought a Mercedes. It was that kind of thing. So, and I think this also takes us back to a more charming world where even if you were rich, you weren't really finding these kinds of status symbol objects, especially by way of the luxury world, the conglomeratized luxury world, was one, not so easy, because there wasn't 1,000 boutiques up and down Fifth Avenue that we all know by name now. I can't tell you exactly what there were, but I'm pretty sure there weren't that many. There was Bergdorf Goodman, and there was Tiffany, and there were a few others. Maybe Gucci, that was its first big moment in the 80s or the late 70s. But this town was not littered with logoized luxury products. Okay, cars, the whole thing. It was a harder thing to get. It was a harder thing to know what to get. So that's one of the big mysteries about. People knew that Patek was a great brand, but the 2499, I don't think so. That would have required a lot of knowledge about that watch. Also, today we think of it as being impossible to find. Apparently, when she walked into Tiffany, there was one in the case. So think about that. And I got a extract from the catalog of 1984 from Tiffany, in which that watch is a 2499, is advertised in the catalog as being available. In other words, it's in the catalog. It's not like we're going to get it to you in 5 years, and it's $25,000, right? So interesting stuff. The way Tiffany worked at the time, I talked to them a lot. I thought that was a fascinating part. But I got interested in the idea of just like, where do you develop that kind of taste where did it come from? We take it so much for granted that that's just the way life is now, that we all see these luxury objects, and this is just, the way people who had means always express it. It's not. This was strange and interesting, and it was a more, I think a time when you expressed your taste a bit more individually, because there wasn't as much stuff to just pile on, and everybody to compete with each other the way that we compete with each other, know. So it was fascinating to me that was a big part of the story I wanted to find out. Why she bought it, and I didn't even answer that question.
Do you have it? I mean, look, it's hard to get into the mind of anyone, but do you have sort of an answer to that, or a prognostication at least?
I do. I did talk to Sean Lennon. He probably regrets it. I hope he doesn't, because I hope the piece was fair. I don't think it was an ugly piece but he was very worried when we spoke about the piece not in some way upsetting his mother. When I tried to get a sense from him, he just said, my parents, he's like, I don't have any interest in stuff like that. I don't do any of that stuff. I never buy anything. I don't like stuff like that, and my parents were really not into stuff like that. They just, and I could kind of see that era of New York, where growing up a kid with a lot of money and just parents just didn't really, that's not what they did. They didn't get into that kind of stuff. I think, nonetheless, what happened, my sense of it is, and there's one part that is in the story and there's one part that's not in the story. She was around, as many people of that era were, and women who were powerful and important and well-known. She had interesting friends who were what you might call men of taste, men in the art world, in the antique world, in the auction world, who knew, again, going back to what I was saying about, you didn't just go around the corner and buy a whole set of furniture from Bodega Veneta because you thought that would be really groovy and everybody would know, like, holy shit, you're rich, right? You didn't do that. There was no such thing. So you had to have somebody, either you were somebody who had integrated yourself enough into those types of worlds and you had taste and all that, and you were developing that stuff, or you were, having kind of the equivalent, I would say, an interior decorator or those kinds of things, be involved in your life and help you find interesting objects and things to collect that were worth the money and that wouldn't make you look silly. She had two very strong friendships at the time. One I mentioned in the piece, which is a guy named Sam Green, who is a forgotten but fascinating figure. He was a kind of a waspy guy. I mention waspiness because it will help you understand why he was so beloved by Warhol, because Warhol loved that type. And he had the kind of stratospheric rise. By the age of 25, he had been made the head of the Contemporary Art Museum in Philadelphia. He was very close to Warhol, a number of artists in that kind of pop art kind of thing. And anyway, he knew very powerful women. He was very close to Diana Vreeland, the editor of Vogue at the time. He had an affair with Barbara Baekeland, who was the heiress to the Bakelite fortune, who was very crazy. He was very close to Yoko, and he was really Greta Garbo's last walker. He went over to her house often, and he spoke to her on the phone every day. So he was an interesting guy, and he's hanging out with Yoko right at the time that they're recording that album. When John gets the watch, I tracked down his papers at the Hodinkee at Yale. There's not a lot of boxes, but what's in the boxes is fascinating, including recordings of all the conversations he had with Greta Garbo. And he had checks to Tiffany that were in that period of time, the 1979, 1980. Makes me think he was going to Tiffany. He knew what was at Tiffany. He's a prime suspect. The other guy who's not in the thing comes into Yoko Ono's life right after Lennon's death, in a kind of, the way it's portrayed in the press is a bit tawdry. This guy shows up. He's another of these guys who's had a kind of shishi antique store on the Upper East Side. Another shape-shifting guy, has a boyfriend, but becomes her live-in friend, or whatever you want to call it. I can't go beyond that, but he's living with Yoko Ono soon after John Lennon dies. He lives with her for the next 20 years. He's a strange guy. He now lives in Europe. He's an artist, painter, and he would never tell me anything except what I got wrong. He tells me that I got everything wrong, even though I know I didn't. But the reason I think he's interesting is that the Times did a couple of pieces on him because he was a guy who had enough of an art career that he was covered in the Times. And it does mention that his father was a watchmaker. And I think that that is very telling, and that he could have been the one who said, you know, if you go over there and get a watch, don't just get the Nautilus, you know, get this one. Or don't go get a Rolex, get the Patek. Somebody told her, because she was not wearing that kind of watch herself. And it, as you all probably would guess, just like me, there's no way somebody would have just, come up with the idea of like, I want a 2499.
So these kind of lay the breadcrumbs for the story. The photo, Yoko buying the watch, obviously, but then Lennon is tragically murdered in 1980, and for a while, nothing comes of the watch. No one really knows it even exists. That all begins to change in the mid-2000s when Yoko, as she's wont to do, kind of becomes part of something that the New York Times, other tabloids reported on a lot in regards to a driver that she had for years, one Carson, I think. I can't remember his first name, but Carson.
Yeah.
Carson. And he becomes sort of the first real breadcrumb that begins the modern era of the story. So can you sort of pick up the story there and what we need to know about Mr. Carson, his relationship with Yoko and with the watch?
Yeah, and I can even help you understand a little bit, because there's like these there are about 10 to 20 year periods between the watch's appearance in some form or fashion, right? So you get, we have 1980. We know he's wearing it. It's his birthday. Okay, then what? The next real appearance of the watch is 2005, when Carson, who's been by that time Yoko's driver and bodyguard for 10 years, so 1995 to 2005, so just keep this in your mind, because it's all kind of like, helps you kind of see the progress of things, where that watch might have been. So in 2005, he's arrested. 2006, he's arrested. He's accused of extortion involving her, in which he has demanded that she pay him $2 million. And he has a lot of complaints about why she owes him this money, that he feels overworked and that he hasn't got paid overtime. And, if he adds it all up, that's what she owes him. And he threatens apparently to kill her and Sean if she won't pay the money. And she promptly calls the cops and they arrest him. There's not a trial, but it's reported on the Times, and it mentions this kind of crazy guy. I mean, guy comes across kind of crazy. He reads a statement that says that she caused him great grief, and that he was her lover as well as her chauffeur and confidant, and that he has ground down 8 teeth as a result of her demands. So basically, it doesn't go to trial. He's allowed to plead guilty, I believe, and then he's basically told to leave the country. He's Turkish, and he goes back to Turkey. So at that time, again, this is just something that happened. Nobody knows anything else, except there was a weird incident at the Dakota last night, okay? And so I knew that happened. I knew that was fascinating, and I'd always heard that maybe this driver, I'd heard somebody, again, in the watch world say stuff like, when I asked these questions, I heard it was a driver, maybe stole it or this or that. So when I saw that, I knew, okay, this is something weird going on. So the next point at which the watch appears is not, you have to go a lot forward to go back, but it appears in 2017, 2017, when a company called Auctionata goes bankrupt. And this is an auction house that was in Berlin, very much a darling of the dot-com era that had started in 2013, 2014. A lot of big companies had funded it, including Arnault, Hearst, Holtzbrink. It had like about $100 million of venture capital. They had a good idea. They were going to do what basically Sotheby's and Christie's are doing now. They just were going to do it way before anybody could, would trust that kind of system, and before they could really develop enough of an inventory to have daily auctions online. But they had a good idea, clearly. I think they were under a lot of pressure. So the point is, they go bankrupt, and I read a German document. After reading those New York Times documents in 2005, I read some German documents in 2017 of this coverage of Auctionata going bankrupt, in which things are found of Beatles memorabilia, and they just mention a watch which had been sold previously. So I kind of start following that, and that allows me to build the story back to 2005. And what happens is I figure out that Karsan says he was given the watch. He has the watch for a year when this incident happens in 2006, when he blows up with Yoko Ono. When he's told to leave the country, he not only takes the watch with him, but he takes the rest of the stuff that becomes the memorabilia that's found at Auctionata. Diaries that John Lennon kept in the last year of his life, which are very, by the way, have been hunted by many, many people. And in fact, a book that was just about to be published 8 months ago by a well-known writer. The book was published. It was supposedly in galleys, ready to go out. Somebody swooped in there and killed that book because he obviously had gotten the same access that I had gotten to these diaries. They were photographed by Auctionata, just like the watch was photographed by Auctionata. So those diaries are not, they were returned. I know I'm going everywhere. The diaries were eventually returned to Yoko Ono, not the watch, because the watch had already been sold. The diaries were photographed by Auctionata, and that's why I guarantee you the reason that writer had the ability to write that book is that he somehow got the photographs from the Auctionata backlog in the same way that I found the picture of the watch from the backlog. Nobody owns it, and it's just kind of floating around. If you can find the right person, you can find lots of interesting things in somebody's iPhone.
I want to get back to the watch in a second, but you mentioned the diary photos. Did you see anything from any photos of the diary, of the pages in the diary, or was that not your beat?
I'm all over that, man.
Yeah? Mm-hmm. Anything interesting you want to share with us right now?
I can't, and I don't even know if I can. Yeah. I don't know if I can do anything with it. Yeah. You know, because this, for that very reason, it's highly. You go back to the J.D. Salinger thing. Why not, huh? Shall we talk about J.D. Salinger? Do you remember when they tried to do a biography of him? Right. You know, you can't just publish. You can't find things and just publish them. There's a copyright even to letters, certainly diaries. But the diaries have some very unflattering material in them. Mm-hmm. I'll just say that about all the people who, the others, apparently the other members of the band, etc.
We'll stick to the watch for now.
Yeah, let's
then.
stick with the watch. Yep.
Karsan, as you mentioned, is deported, goes back to Turkey, and then you start to pick up the trail of the watch from there. It passes hands before it gets to Auctionata. So can you just talk a little bit about those links?
Yeah, I kind of jumped forward. So yes, what happens is he goes to Turkey. He's got this watch. So keep in mind, so he leaves New York in 2006. It's not until 2009 that he decides that this watch might be something that, you know, he can get something out of. I don't think he was wearing this watch. I don't even know if he really knew what that watch was beyond the fact that it was John Lennon's. Again, we all have to assume that, does this guy know what a 2499 is? You know, I don't think so. I mean, I think he knew they had nice things, but I don't think he totally got that. So I think he had this watch and he started to think, okay, well, it's got this inscription that we all know about, right? That's never been found. And that obviously is proof that, because it's not been known, it's proof of the watch's origin. So he has a friend who is a fellow Turk who lives in Berlin. And at the time, Karsan apparently wants to buy a house and he doesn't have the money to put down for the house. So he asks his friend, this is the way I understand it, I would like to give you this watch as collateral for a loan. And the friend says, sure. I think he also gave the friend all the other stuff that he had, the memorabilia, so the diaries and all that, which were supposedly worth more than the watch. At least that's what Auctionata thought. And the guy takes it all back to Berlin, and so that's 2009. So he hangs on to this stuff for about 5 years. At some point, he decides either maybe Karsan's not paying him back, or I don't know, I can't get to the bottom of that. He decides to take the watch to Auctionata. He likes old cars, and he runs across a guy who's at Auctionata, who's one of the heads of Auctionata. They get drunk together. He mentions that he's got this watch. The guy's eyes fall out of his head. He says, "Well, why don't you have why don't you at least find out what it's worth? I'll put you in touch with my watch guy at Auctionata." That happens. Next thing you know, it's going to be auctioned. It's photographed for the auction. They're getting excited, but they don't have the provenance story correct, right? So they're like, how are we going to sell this story? How did this guy get this watch? Like we know that the inscriptions, obviously, let's do this. Let's get an extract from Patek. Of course it'll say it's stolen if it's really stolen, right? So they kind of use that as an excuse. Then they have Karsan do an affidavit swearing to the fact that he's been given this watch and that he would never lie about such a thing. And so anyway, they get to a point where they're just scrambling, trying to find a way to make the story hold together, that this is the watch and it's not stolen, that the Turk who has the watch, Erhan G, as he's called in the story, gets cold feet, doesn't want to have it auctioned. Everybody knows Yoko Ono has the long arm of the law on her side. I mean, she is very good at suing people. And so and so they decide just to do it private treaty. So I know byways and highways of the story are crazy, right? Are you about to fall asleep? So the auctionata finds a private buyer, a man named Mr. A, not the Mr. A that was here before. I will confirm that. Yeah. We did have a Mr. A. He's also Italian, though, so I want to make sure it's not him. But a Mr. A is who he's known as. It's the way he's identified in this this court document that comes out. We can talk about that in a second. Mr. A buys this watch. He's reassured. He feels, as he told me, that he didn't think the watch was stolen. He thinks that that Karsan did, in fact, was given to him as a gift. So he buys the watch for 600,000 euros in 2014. And he takes the watch to Christie's 2 months later, even though he said he wouldn't, apparently. And Christie's does their due diligence, and they call Yoko, and she says, "What are you talking about? That watch is in my house." And they say, "No, it's not." And she says, "Let me check." And then she comes back, and she says, "I want that watch back. That's my watch." And so it suddenly, that's the beginning of the watch being put in limbo in Geneva. It's supposedly in an escrow agreement between Mr. A's lawyer and Christie's, maybe somehow still involved. They wouldn't talk about it. And Yoko trying to get the watch, and the judgment, we're waiting, and I think it could be any day. The final decision is before the Supreme Court because it's been appealed a couple of times by Mr. A. And it will be decided soon who is what they say, sole and right only owner, I believe, which has been the prevailing judgment so far in all the cases. But the question then to me, which is not in the story, is how do you get it back, even so, right? We all know how hard those things are.
Especially in Switzerland, huh?
Yeah, and like you're in New York, that's in Switzerland, Mr. A's in Italy. The watch is in Switzerland, and supposedly there is an agreement. So, and he did tell me, yes, I'll honor the agreement. But the last time I talked to him, he said, but we have a plan if they find that she's the rightful owner. So I don't know what that means. But
do you have a feel for what happens at Christie's during that 6 months or so where they take the watch in and then figure out what's going on with it, and then eventually the call is made to Yoko, or Yoko finds out that the watch is indeed not in her cupboard or locked away wherever, but it's in Geneva and at Christie's. Do you have a feel for how they handled that situation, or anything you didn't get into in the article?
Yeah, well, two things that I think are just to keep in mind. Not only did she not know the watch was gone, apparently, and a number of people told me that, but she hadn't known the watch hadn't been there since 1980.
Yeah.
Okay, so just check that out. I mean, think about that for a second. What else is in that Dakota apartment? You know what I mean? But because she had locked it away in 1981. She had an inventory of all Lennon's things taken in 1981. Results in like a 1,000-page document. There are mention of 2 watches in it. One is a pocket watch. One is and I'm not saying this is the way they're described, but I know pretty well that the 2 watches that are mentioned are a pocket watch, a Patek, one that was some of you may have followed it. It's been sold twice, once in the 80s and recently it was resold again. So a Patek pocket watch and then this watch, okay? So, and then she puts it away in this room, closet. I'm not sure. It's a room of some kind where she keeps these kind of valuable things. It's locked. This guy Coral Carson was trusted enough to have a key to that room, and all I can figure is she never checked on the watch again for 34 years. Maybe somebody else did who worked for her. Maybe not. I don't know. But that's kind of a fascinating thing. So Christie's, I think, just followed. As well as if anyone here can tell me how things like this work at an auction house in Switzerland, I'd love to know. But there are certain expectations they have for what they're going to do when they get pieces like this. They have to establish the fact that it wasn't stolen. I'll tell you this: I know for a fact that if you do claim something is stolen, you pretty much have to prove it, or they will. And I don't mean they, Christie's, but an auction house will go ahead and sell that thing if you can't prove it. You can't just call up and say, that was mine. You have to have a police report. You have to have a number of documents that are serious enough for them to think it's real. She had never reported it as being stolen because she didn't know it was stolen. That's another reason we would think she probably hadn't checked on it in many years. If she had checked on it, she would have known it wasn't there, right? And she would have called the cops and said, somebody stole this. Presumably it's insured. I don't know, but so she didn't know it was stolen. She then had to present them with some kind of believable case that watch was stolen and not given away, because this happens all the time. Paintings, I'm sure many of you bid on things. This is a typical problem auction houses have, is proving or disproving people's claims of ownership when it's illegitimate, and vice versa. So I know that they felt like they had documents that made them believe that it was a believable case, and then I think that probably sets something in motion that they can't stop. I would imagine, right? There's got to be some series of legal things that you have to follow. I know this too, that there is a position, apparently, I was unable to look into this, but I found it interesting, that each auction house at least has one perhaps more of a Swiss government official of some kind hired by the government to be kind of embedded, as I understood it, in these very types of situations as a kind of overseer of how to navigate this kind of thing. So I don't know what that person did in this case, but I know that the watch was quickly put in escrow. It was kept at Christie's for the next several years, and it may still be there, or it may be under the lock and key of Mr. A's lawyer. The reason I think the lawyer has some connection to it, and this is kind of interesting, I think, is that we have to talk about that document, that we have to talk about the court document if I'm going to tell you about that, because they won't understand it, I don't think.
Well, let's talk about how it all comes to a
Yeah.
legal head. So what happens is Mr. A is the one that actually sues to try to make a legal claim to the watch, right? And that's how things come to a head about a year ago when we first get the Swiss court decision saying that Yoko Ono is indeed the rightful owner of this watch and not Mr. A. We're now waiting on the final appeals process is kind of where it stands. But can you just sort of talk about that court document that you're referencing and what that tells us?
A year ago. So I'm reporting this story, and I'm kind of, think I'm the only, I'm just alone, with, doing my thing. And I pretty much have put together the constellation of characters and the route, and I have it. I don't have a way of factually proving all the different stops and risks that this watch visits, okay? So at that time, September, I planned to meet Mr. A in Italy. I fly to Italy and he stands me up. I get back 2 days later, so it's right after Labor Day, and a small website in Switzerland called Gotham City, which basically digs through court documents in Switzerland for stuff like this, stolen gems, art, controversies of various kinds. Clearly there are plenty. This young woman named Colleen Emel finds this strange document that has been buried in the court docket. I don't even know what it is. I'm not sure even how she found it, because the Swiss courts don't they don't come out with their decisions and say, here's a decision, for the front page of the newspaper. They just kind of put it somewhere that maybe can be found if you're really good at knowing how to look into court papers. So she finds this thing after being on summer vacation. She goes back and through the summer and she finds a document. Now, this document that comes out from Switzerland, because of privacy law, every name, entity, litigant, et cetera, associated or named in the thing has been given a letter as their identity, as what they're a pseudonym, kind of, right? So that's why I call him Mr. A. Yoko is Mrs. C. John Lennon is F. Okay, that kind of stuff. So you actually had to know something in order to even understand it. Truly, it's like a cryptogram. You can't understand the court document. I mean, you read it too. Yeah. So, it was hard. You had to already kind of know a little bit about it, and it doesn't name the watch. It doesn't say Patek. It doesn't say any of that stuff, right? So it's all very mysterious. She knew enough that she thought, oh, this has something to do with Yoko Ono. So she published this thing, and basically what it was the first decision in the court record that had been filed, and it was the result of Mr. A trying to get ahead of her coming after him by him going after her. So he sued her basically for ownership. What that means, go figure. I don't know, but the court found in her favor, and he appeals it, and that's why it's before the Supreme Court. So my point was, why did we bring that up? Because it was about, oh yes. So I was just going to say the only people identified in a document like that are the lawyers. Their names will be in there. That's just kind of practice. But Mr. A's lawyer is not in there. It's very strange, very suspicious. I think what it means through the reporting that I got is that they're afraid that if they identify him, he may be in jeopardy of being robbed of the watch again. Because remember, the estimates of the value, and everybody can, raise their hand and tell me whether they agree with this, of the watch is $20 to $40 million. And that's a lot of money. So I guess you don't want him walking around on the street in Geneva or wherever he is, knowing where he has the watch, which I assume is not in his home safe. But that's the only reason that we can imagine that he's an unknown part of the story, the lawyer himself.
But that also seems to indicate that he does have it in lock and key somewhere, perhaps not in his custody, but he's the one that knows where it is. And if and when this finally reaches a resolution, you kind of hinted at it earlier, we might not be at the final chapter yet here. And for a watch that's been under such scrutiny for 30, 40 years now, I can't imagine it would be a clean ending.
I got to keep, would anybody read a book about this?
Right.
Maybe. Yeah, no, I think that there is a whole thing about, like I say, not only what's going to happen, but then how does it happen that it gets from where it is now to where the court says it's supposed to go? Right. I don't know. And there's lots of people who have skirted around in the dark peripheries of this story that I couldn't find or get to in time for the story in the New Yorker, but are still there, So I feel like it's still got that episodic crime thriller quality to it, and plus the layering of each of these characters who get a hold of this watch are for the most part quite eccentric. I mean, like the guy who was the Berlin Erhan G made his money making shipping pallets, like like wooden shipping pallets. So it's a Coen Brothers moment. Every moment is like a Coen Brothers movie. There's some weird, like fascinating personality at each step of the way.
You mentioned people on the periphery. Auction specialists have been posting about the watch even. I can imagine for any of them that they're licking their chops. This is a career moment, the chance to sell John Lennon's watch, perhaps the most valuable watch in the world.
Yes.
It's been a few months now since the story published. I'm wondering if you have a feel for what's been happening in the past few months as far as like people circling the watch and hoping to potentially get their hands on it, or what might happen.
I think so. I mean, I've had a couple of conversations like that, but I think they're just really waiting. I think there's a frozen moment here, you know what I mean, where it now that story is out there, and that it's clear there's a decision that's going to be made, which is going to really, I think, establish whether the watch is in fact a stolen object or not a stolen object. It will allow for, I mean, I would imagine if it does go to Mr. A, I can't see him not trying to auction it. I really can't, right? So that would definitely be an opportunity. Do I see Yoko auctioning it? She's not well. She lives upstate now. She's, basically not been seen. I don't think she needs the money. I mean, she's worth like $900 million or something like that, apparently. Yet she's very. I think the reason she's worth that much is because she built what John had as his own fortune. Perhaps she's the one that built it. I can't say that enough, but she was involved a lot in building the licensing and a lot of the stuff that really created a real fortune. So she is a business-minded person. Would she? So in that way, maybe she would. And Sean doesn't seem to have any real interest in it. I don't know. The quote that's kind of a heartbreaking quote is that part about, like, I would never wear anything that was my dad's. I haven't even played one of his guitars. I mean, there is a pathos to the story. I would say that's the other thing that interested in me, just as a last bit. There's something very sad and melancholy about the whole thing. The last years of John Lennon's life, kind of being cooped up in that apartment, finally comes out, makes music. This watch, what the watch represented as maybe a rapprochement between, the two of them and their relationship. They'd had some rocky things to navigate. It's all very mysterious.
And it all kind of is encapsulated in the caseback engraving, which I had heard about but never seen until you posted the photo and then the caption in the story, which is kind of how you end the story, actually.
Yeah. Because the story to me comes back to that it does become what makes it really valuable, I think, to anyone who would ever own it is not just, of course, it's the 4th series Patek, it's yellow gold, it's all these things that, don't make it the most valuable of the 2499s, but it's obviously it was his. I think it's pretty clear he was wearing it when he was shot. That's something I kind of feel fairly certain about. That means something, that's intense. And then the engraving, which is the quote from one of the songs in the album, just like starting over, as it says, love Yoko. So to me, it's about, it represents its own sense of time and the sense of that last few months they had together. And, that's something more. If you're interested in time as a metaphor, it's built into the object.
One of the biggest memento moris of all, perhaps. But I think that's a great place to end the conversation about John Lennon's 2499. Thanks again to Jay Fielden for joining us.
Thank you.